All right, here we go with the MGM UA letterboxed reissue of Magnificent Seven. This is bundled with the first feature sequel, Return of the Seven. This was their attempt at doing a restoration back in the early 90s, specifically for this Laserdisc release. There was an early release in 91 that is noticeably worse for wear. This is a pretty nice reissue they did, and they give you a nice bit of technical notes about the restoration. They also did extensive cleanup on the original mono mix. They'd wanted to try and find all of the stems in stereo for the music, score and effects and everything, but unfortunately they couldn't find any. So this was a very, very good attempt at the time for doing a restoration as is. Of course, not anywhere near as good as what you'd get these days, but it's much nicer than the later release, and than the earlier release. And as a nice bonus, you get the first sequel. Unfortunately, they didn't do the other two, but it's still the best release on Laserdisc and has the original mono mix cleaned up very nicely. So, of course, if you're like me and you're into comparing transfers, you need the older disc too. Unfortunately, I don't have that currently, but I do know it's supposed to not look as good, but I'm hoping to pick that up and do a comparison at some point. But still, all in all, this is the best release of Magnificent 7 you get on Laserdisc, and it looks and sounds wonderful. And it's nice that they threw in the first sequel, too. Here we have Merlin Retinas One-Eyed Jacks from Paramount, letterboxed. For the longest time, because this film was out of print, this was the best and only release in letterbox that you could actually get pretty much anywhere in the world. Now they've completed a new restoration and it's out on Criterion, so you can pick that up. But I was actually quite happy to finally find this. I wanted to check it out, and this is before they did the restoration, so it's nice to finally see this. And of course, being a VistaVision film, it's kind of it's really a crime to see it in pan and scan. Artistically and historically, it's very important. This is the only film Brando ever directed. This was the film that Stanley Kubrick was working on until he was dismissed, and that made him available to take over on Spartacus. So this, if you read the production history of this film, it's actually quite involved and quite long, and it took years to get this film made finally. And it was kind of viewed as a failure upon the original release. Didn't really make a whole lot of money, but at least if I remember correctly. But it is really interesting to look at. Brando does some different things directing it, and the performances are all strong, and it is a good Western. It's very different. So if you haven't seen it, definitely give it a shot. And this is a nice Laserdisc pressing for the time. It's a later Paramount disc from I think about 93 or so. You do want to be careful though, because they did have a pan and scan version that looks identical, so you need to get one with the widescreen banner across the top. Transfer is very nice, so it's a nice one to finally have. It's not too common though. Next we have the letterboxed reissue of How the West Was Won from MGM UA. There are some early releases that are pan and scan analog only. The soundtrack was mixed into Dolby Surround on the digital tracks. However, there are some complaints among really diehard fans of this film that only the old analog only discs have the mix correct. There's some who say that from this release onward, including the new restored Blu-ray, that the sound remixing kind of went a little bit too far in terms of mixing the score and some of the directional cues and things. I haven't really done a detailed comparison, but that's just what I've heard. But still, this is a very nice disc to have, and you can get it for pretty cheap. Of course, it's a nice MGM kind of blending of original artwork and kind of newer artist renderings, and it just looks nice across the gatefold jacket. And the gatefold is very, very well done, using original images across the whole span of the gatefold, and then it gives you some nice text talking about the importance of this as, really the great narrative Cinerama production. And you get the rear, and you do get some technical notes, which is well, really just really a technical blur. But of course, this being an earlier transfer, they certainly didn't get anywhere near the full width of the entire 3-panel Cinerama image. That really wasn't achieved until the new Blu-ray release, where you can watch it flat and an almost 2.89 ratio, or you can watch the, if you have the special edition, they made a Smilebox curved screen recreation attempt, and that's like a 2.7 ratio, but you have the Smilebox format, which basically curves the black letterboxing on the top and the bottom, kind of like this, into sort of what resembles an inverted smile on top and bottom, to sort of give the impression of the curvature. And it's certainly nice to see it that way, but it's also nice to see it on Laserdisc and see what it used to look like if you saw it many years before, growing up on television and such. And you know, this is a pretty nice transfer of a film that's very hard to transfer, being a complete 3-strip epic Cinerama narrative that was extremely long as well. So it's certainly a lot better than the older pressings. It has a nice soundtrack, has a nice transfer, but do be aware that there are some who say the older transfers have a more accurate sound mix. And if you haven't seen the Smilebox version on Blu-ray, definitely it's a real treat. Here we go with the Pioneer Special Edition of The Professionals. This is actually a very nice disc of a classic Western that doesn't really get talked about enough these days. Of course, you get the usual lovely PSC banner and jacket with the limited availability sticker. There were some earlier editions of this, but I wanted to pick this one up because it has a digital stereo track that I wanted to compare to the DVD and Blu-ray 5.1, and it actually compares up pretty darn well, and I'm almost thinking that this is actually a different mix. So if you're a really big fan of this film and you have the Blu-ray or you want to pick it up on Laserdisc, you'll want to find this one because it's a very nicely done title. Of course, all of these Pioneer Special Editions are nice. Unfortunately, this one doesn't really have any special features, but the transfer's good and the sound is excellent. So yeah, there's the Professionals. Here we have the Fox Special Widescreen Edition of Little Big Man, the Arthur Penn Western with Dustin Hoffman. This release is interesting because for the longest time this film was out of print and you had a hard time finding it, and then you couldn't get it with the original mono track, which this has. It's now come out on Blu-ray and some other regions, and it does have the original mono, but of course import discs can add up pretty quick, and I found this for pretty cheap, so I wanted to see the film again, and it had been a long time, so I figured why not. It's actually quite a nice transfer on here, and of course the cover looks nice. It is interesting that this has the usual Fox black bar on the top with the widescreen logo, and then the bottom is blank, which is more akin to one of their panhead scan discs. Usually you get the nice black bar on top and bottom to suggest letterboxing like the Paramount covers did. So I've noticed there's a handful of titles that did that. I don't know why, but still the cover looks very nice. And you get a wonderful information-laden gatefold that's got its own lovely design that fits perfectly with the film, and it doesn't look like the usual Fox where you have Fox jacket where you have a picture and then you have a bunch of wasted space and a background color and such. So I was actually quite happy to see they put a little more effort into this. I think this is a slightly later disc than the usual ones. Yeah, this is 93, so this disc was made in 93, so that's probably why. And of course the rear cover is not a standard Fox cover either, and it really goes with the film very well. So it was a nice surprise when I picked this up to see that it actually had a real cover and rear design. And of course you get the note that it is monaural, and the 5.1 mix on this film is just not very good at all. So it's very important to have the mono for this. So, and it's a pretty good transfer too, so it's a nice release to have. We have the MGM letterbox release of Quickly Down Under. This is a pretty common title. A lot of people have it. This is really one of the last, feature westerns that got a full theatrical release and had a decent budget. Didn't really have much of a marketing campaign, kind of came and went. And sure, it's not the greatest Western in the world, but, you know, it serves its purpose, is beautifully photographed, and it has a pretty nice Laserdisc transfer. It is a... yeah, it's still an MGM release, and it's a MGM UA release that's a little bit earlier, so it still has the silver labels. You can usually tell the later MGM releases that are going to be a bit better in quality or when they already switched over to the yellow and black labels that look like the old 60s MGM record labels. But still, all that aside, even though there's a little noise in the transfer, it's quite good, and the beautiful photography comes across very well. It has the original soundtrack, and it's Dolby Stereo on the digital tracks, and it comes across nicely. The mix doesn't have a whole lot of surround engagement in it, but it sounds great in a home theater setup, so you can usually get this one for less than $1. Here we have really essential title here. This is the standard letterbox release of Dances with Wolves. This is the theatrical cut, and it has the original 2.0 Dolby Surround mix on the digital tracks. Has a wonderful transfer for the time period. And of course, this was the best way to watch the theatrical cut for a long time, because when they made the long cut for the later Laserdisc box set, and then excepting the first DVDs, the really early ones that had the theatrical cut, pretty much every other release featured the long cut. And it wasn't until the British Blu-ray came out a couple years ago that you could actually get the theatrical cut in HD. And you can still get that one, but you have to import it if you're really a fan of the shorter 3-hour version. But this is a very common Laserdisc, and you also want to distinguish, you get the letterboxed version, which you can tell by this bar up here, as opposed to the pan and scan. It's a very nice transfer. I was quite surprised when I spun this up, and you get a lovely gatefold. And of course, they kind of use this type of artwork for the first DVDs as well, so they kind of stuck with that. So if you've seen those, or you've seen the VHS editions, this will look pretty familiar. But because this is so common, here's the rear here. Because this is so common, you definitely can't pass it up, and it looks and sounds outstanding, especially for being a disc from about 90 or 91 or so. Of course, distributed by Image. Doesn't have any rot issues. Sometimes a few Image discs can do that, but from my experience, it's usually been with a lot of the older classics titles they did. But yeah, this is a wonderful release of the theatrical cut, and if you want to see this shorter version again, and you're looking just for a good version on Laserdisc without springing for the big box set of the extended cut, I definitely recommend this one. I don't have the first film because the letterbox version is pretty hard to come by, but here is the letterbox edition of Young Guns 2 from Fox, even though it later transferred over to being a Warner Brothers owned title. It's a pretty decent transfer. It has the original mix, the original Dolby mix, so you get a nice stereo surround track. I'd say definitely the audio fares better than the video, although the picture quality isn't bad, but you know, it is a Fox letterbox transfer from about 91 or so. So if you've seen other Fox titles from that era, you kind of know what to expect with their letterbox titles. But still, it's actually a very nice disc, and it definitely compares very well against the DVD, which is an earlier snapper case release. If you know how those were, they could be either Laserdisc ports, better than the Laserdisc, or worse than the Laserdisc. And this holds up pretty well. I'd say they were about relatively equal. But I do like this film because it's darker than the first one. It has a good number of more traditional Western elements, and some really great legendary cast members appear. And you put James Coburn in a movie, and I have to see it at some point or another. But you know, it's honestly, it holds up okay, I would suppose. And you can get this one for pretty cheap, so I figured why not. It's the first film that you can find pan and scanned, but finding the letterboxed edition is rather difficult. Speaking of letterboxed later issues, here is the letterboxed later issue of City Slickers. It did get a THX mastering stamp. This one is much less common than the earlier pan and scan release, so I was actually quite pleased to finally find this and give it a shot because I hadn't seen this film in years. The transfer is pretty good, and it has the 2.0 Dolby Stereo SR mix on the digital tracks, and that sounds pretty nice. So no real special features or anything, but it's a nice release to have if you can actually find the letterboxed edition. Continuing on, here's the last of my Western shelf. This is the letterboxed edition of Tombstone. This is a I'd say pretty darn good transfer, actually. I was quite surprised how well it holds up. There's a couple spots of aliasing on some of the backgrounds, but other than that, it looks great, and it does have the original sound mix, the 2.0 Dolby SR mix on the digital tracks. No AC3. This came out from, I believe, Hollywood Touchstone, so it is a Disney disc. So let me show you the rear cover. You can see that usual design Disney used on all of their Hollywood, Touchstone, etc. adult releases on Laserdisc. Spread across 3 sides, and like I said, the transfer is very good, but the interesting thing about this disc is that after the film ends, it goes into a bit of deleted material that's introduced by the credited director, George P. Cosmatos, and he does a little introduction on 5 brief deleted scenes before they show the theatrical trailer. And 4 of those 5 scenes were later incorporated into the DVD director's cut. But for some reason, the 5th scene, which is literally about a minute or so, and I don't know why it was not put back in, but for some reason it's not in that DVD version. And then when the Blu-ray came out, it was reverted back to this theatrical cut. So, and that Blu-ray does not have those deleted scenes. So if you want to have that one deleted scene that runs about a minute, you have to pick this Laserdisc up and play side 3 and play that particular chapter where the director talks about these 5 very brief scenes that were cut out. And they're very brief. They're almost so brief they're inconsequential. But this film was originally supposed to be about a 3-hour long cut, and there was a troubled production history, and it was cut down to its 2-hour and 20 or so minute runtime. And I'd like to see a release one day with all of the deleted material either put back in where it was supposed to go, or at least just presented as extra bonus features, because there's a whole backstory about this production being very troubled and the film barely getting done. So it's important to have this Laserdisc, to have the original 2.0 surround mix, and to have all of those deleted bits at the end. So, you know, don't go out of your way to get this just for that, thinking you're going to see new story elements, because you're really not. But, you know, you can pick this up for a couple bucks. It can be a little trickier to find, but you find it eventually. Now we're going to move on to my small shelf of comic properties, superheroes, comic strip characters. And of course, we're going to start with one of my favorite discs that got me really hooked on the format, the Warner's letterbox release of Batman. This is a wonderful disc, and a wonderful disc to get started on the format like I did. Of course, it uses the original theatrical one sheet that was used on all of the '89 marketing, and it's a beautiful Laserdisc jacket, simple idea, and they use the standard Warner stereo digitally processed Laserdisc blap that they usually put on the rear cover. They put it down here in the black area to keep the bat shield unspoiled. So I was very happy to find this still in the shrink wrap, and I've kept it that way simply because I love how they use the cover so much. And the rear uses the Batman Joker still beautifully across the top, and they have a nice prestigious look to it by keeping the Batman logo and then putting a yellow bar across, and then having all the chapter stops written out in the Warner italic font. It has a much classier look to it than the usual Warner rear cover, and I really appreciated that. This was a film that was their big prestigious release of the year, and it got a nice Laserdisc jacket to go with that. In terms of transfer and importance and such, for both Burton Batman films, they were very dark films, and all of the video releases for both films have been printed much lighter in home video, starting with the VHS and Laserdisc releases, then the DVDs, and then even the Blu-ray is not quite as dark as what the theatrical prints were like. But if you've ever seen this film before on tape or DVD, or if you ever watched it at home on a TV, it's going to look just fine. But if you ever see it theatrically on a 35mm print, you'll notice right off the bat it's a much darker piece. But anyway, this is a wonderful transfer for the time period. 1990, I believe, is when this disc was made. And on a really good CRT like I have the one of the Sony HD tube sets with the really deep blacks. It kind of starts to fill in some of that brightness that happened on the video transfers. So it's a very good transfer, and it's letterboxed. If you pick up the full screen tape or the watch the full screen side of the DVD, it's actually an open matted transfer because this film was shot spherically. So that's a nice alternate to have if you're interested. But most important about this disc is the soundtrack. It's a 2.0 track, Dolby Surround on the digital tracks, and it is apparently the original mix because it has a much deeper low end and bass content. It feels heavier, and you notice it right off the bat if you watch the Blu-ray or the special edition DVD, and they have 5.1 mixes. And if you watch the opening titles, when the music swells up for the actual Batman title card, it's just there. The music doesn't really quite swell up. I mean, it does, but on this release and the first DVD that uses the same audio mix transposed into 5.1, there's a huge amount of bass that swells up with the Batman title card, so it really reverberates through your home theater environment when you watch this disc or that first DVD, and that's the first time you really notice it. Overall, they're not terribly different or anything, but if you've seen this film as many times as I have, and then you go to the Blu-ray again for the first time in a while, you're kind of like, man, I wish I was watching my Laserdisc because I still love that old mix. I don't know if it's a matter of this was the Dolby Master for the 35mm release and the later track is from the 70mm master. I just don't know, but I know there's an audible difference in some scenes, so it's nice to have for this. And if you get that first DVD, the old snapper case flipper DVD, it's an early one. The transfer is very noisy, but it's the same master as the Laserdisc. The only benefit of having that is you get the this wonderful sound mix done up into 5.1 if you want to hear it that way. Next we have the masterpiece is Tim Burton's Batman Returns. Again, beautiful usage of the theatrical one-sheet artwork on the Laserdisc jacket. This time they didn't even put any blurbs on it. All you get is the standard LD logo down here, but it's rendered in blue as to not distract from the snowy blue atmosphere of this cover. But this is just one of the great Laserdisc covers from the United States because it just looks beautiful, and they didn't clog it up with any unnecessary bits. I show you the rear here. Again, going with a much more artfully designed rear cover and not the standard Warner Brothers, black down the center and then the big silver stripe on the back and all that that they stuck with for so long. Very wonderful picture transfer, and of course it has a 2.0 Dolby Surround mix on the digital tracks. This disc is very well known to be a sufferer of disc rot, and I had to get a second copy that thankfully is not rotted, so they do exist. This was made by the Sony Columbia DADC plant, unfortunately, so you do have to dig around to get a disc without rot. This copy, it is my rotter one. I just kept it because the cover's so good looking. But the rot really isn't that bad. It's really just some speckles around the side changes, and it doesn't really get critical or anything bad. So the most of the cases of disc rot on this title are the speckly kind, but just to let you know, it is out there. In terms of importance, of course, like I said about Batman '89, the theatrical prints of this film are much darker, and I've been fortunate enough to see one, and it is absolutely beautiful. So as good as the Blu-ray scan, the HD scan is in terms of detail, even that doesn't match up to how good the theatrical print of this film looks. But that said, on a good setup, this Laserdisc actually looks wonderful. It looks just as good as the first DVD version, and that 2.0 mix is pretty much what you heard in theaters, because this film was the film that premiered Dolby 5.1 AC3 worldwide, but about 99% of theaters still ran the Dolby SR 2.0 stereo surround track, and that's what I saw in that particular print. Apparently at that time there were only about 10 or 11 theaters in the world that were even equipped to show prints with Dolby AC3 on them. So even though this film was technically the first to be released in Dolby AC3, about maybe 5 or so theaters in the world actually showed it that way. So it's important to have this Laserdisc to have the 2.0 mix. That's what, almost everybody heard when they saw it. So, and in comparing the two, they're pretty much the same, but I do like having the original track available. And this is a very nice transfer, even though, you have that whole issue of the prints are very dark and all the video releases are kind of brightened up a bit. It's a very nice Laserdisc transfer if you can find one that doesn't have rot speckles and stuff. So. Here we go with the 1993 release, Batman Mask of the Phantasm. This is one of the, I'll just go ahead and say it, this is the greatest Batman film released to date in terms of nailing the character and his atmosphere. The tone is beautiful. If you've never seen this, go see it immediately, even if you're a passing fan of Batman. Of course, originally this film was designed to be a direct-to-video release, the first done for the legendary Batman the Animated Series, and the dailies and rushes and stills look so good, the studio decided that they were just going to release it theatrically and gave the team a few weeks to get it ready, and then they just dumped it into theaters for a couple days and pulled it with literally no advertising. So pretty much the whole audience for this film basically found it on video. And although I will admit, one of my great childhood memories was, I think I was literally about 3 at the time, I actually got to see it in theaters. I dragged my mom to take me, and I just remember bits and pieces, but I was just blown away. But anyway, long story short, this is a wonderful Laserdisc, and for a long time, until the Warner Archive Blu-ray release came out, this was really as good as it got. There is a letterboxed DVD release that uses the same master as this, but this has the 2.0 stereo surround mix as PCM, whereas the DVD was lossy Dolby 2.0. So in terms of audio, this trounced the DVD. The VHS releases were a 1.33 ratio, and that's what the original intent was, because it was designed to be released on video. The theatrical release necessitated them being able to mat to 1.85, and so a lot of the shots had to be double checked to make sure that they would work in 1.85. And when you watch this letterbox transfer, or the DVD that was letterboxed at 1.85, you'll notice that some shots are way too tight in places, but then other things fare just fine. And if you look at the new Warner Archive Blu-ray, they were nice enough to feature both the 1.85 matting and the 1.33 matting. So you do get the benefit of being able to switch back and forth between the two. And the picture quality of that new Blu-ray is absolutely staggering. I will say, though, that I've watched this transfer so many times. It has a particular golden hue to it, and the colors come across as a bit different. So if you compare this to the new HD master, you're going to notice that the newer version has a different color tone to it. I think part of the color difference is this being a old analog video master, and some things don't necessarily translate as well as a brand new HD scan. However, you know, I'm still going to hang on to this because I'm used to this. And another thing I noted is the new Blu-ray has the 2.0 mix preserved, and it sounds great, but I think they went to whatever the source in the vault was, because it does have a slightly harsher quality on a lot of the dialogue, and this has a much warmer quality to the audio. They probably went to the 35mm Printmaster to do this, as they did a lot of Laserdiscs during this time in the early 90s. They would go to the Printmaster Dolby SR mag track and just transfer that straight over. So you get the benefit of coming straight from the Printmaster source, which could have variations from what's been sitting on the vault shelves ever since. So if you have this disc and you have the Blu-ray and you're like, oh, I'm just going to get rid of this, take a second to compare the two. You'll notice there's some just a different feeling to the audio, different quality to it, and I was quite surprised. That's not saying the Blu-ray audio is bad; it's great, but I'm just so used to this, and I've seen this film so many times that any type of variation will just immediately pop up and start beating me over the head. But this is a wonderful Laserdisc letterboxed, and you know, it's pretty much. I'll just quite say it is harder to find than the regular Bat films, because it was an animated title. It was mostly distributed on VHS, so the Laserdisc was really only bought by animation collectors at the time. So it's not as common, but you can pick it up for a decent price. And yeah, it's just this film is incredible, and it gets better with age, absolutely. So definitely have it in your Bat collection. Now this is a film I found myself defending for a long time. This is Batman Forever. This is a pretty darn near reference disc for Laserdisc. Has a fantastic picture transfer. It's letterboxed. I think it's pretty much near the original 185. I haven't actually gotten out the tape and done measuring on my TV, but it's pretty much around there. And it has a 2.0 Dolby Stereo surround track on the digital tracks, and it has 5.1 AC3. Again, uses the original theatrical one sheet for the front, and then the rear has a nice rendered jacket that fits with the film tone, and thankfully the usual bland Warner rear cover is gone. It's spread across 3 sides, and side 3 is CAV. I do think this film has great elements in it. It was hacked apart by the studio at the last minute, and most people are unaware of this, and then they make usual complaints, and unfortunately some people confuse this with Batman and Robin, which it is not, and they should not be compared to one another. But yeah, if you realize that the studio cut down at least 25 to 35 minutes out of this, and then completely restructured the entire first third to half of the film, causing a lot of narrative and logical issues, it starts to become apparent that, you know, the narrative bones that are in here still in the theatrical release, you know, you can kind of see where they were going. And I definitely suggest picking up the tie-in paperback novelization that uses the original script and even adds some additional changes. That is a fantastic read, because they cut out the narrative heart of this story, and that really, I don't know why they decided to cut out the entire meaning of the movie and the title and everything. But anyway, all that aside, the other important thing about this Laserdisc is this is one of those rare cases where the 2.0 stereo surround track is better mixed than the 5.1. They're the same source track. I don't know how this happened or why. The only thing I can figure is that being a 95 release, most theaters were still playing Dolby Stereo SR and not focusing on the digital track, or just didn't have digital equipment. So they still had to put a lot of time and effort into the analog optical mix. And it uses the surround channel much more inventively and much better than the 5.1. The dialogue comes across as smoother. The 5.1 has the dialogue sound just a bit harsh. Of course, the 5.1 is discrete, so you have better usage of all the various sound channels, and you have a stereo surround field instead of a mono surround field. But especially in a modern home theater environment where the Dolby Pro Logic decoders have gotten so advanced, I mean, it's night and day almost if you go back and forth enough. And that's not saying that the 5.1 track is bad, but if you have the ability to play 2.0 and decode it out properly, this is a wonderful mix. And I'd say watch it with the 2.0 over the 5.1 any day. But still, this is a great Laserdisc. You can pick it up for nothing. Picture quality and audio quality is fantastic. And absolutely. Now, here we have everybody's favorite whipping boy. This is the Batman and Robin letterboxed Laserdisc release from Warner Brothers. Definitely the hardest to find of the 4 Bat films. And again, like Batman Returns, this film is very well known for being a big rotter title. But this one, pretty much all the cases of rot are critical, so you have to double check every side of this if you finally manage to get one. And I found one in a store and the cover was a little scrunched, but I figured, you know what, I might as well try it. I already have too many copies of this. What's one more? And I was quite pleased to find it's actually, it plays through just fine. There's a little bit of speckling at the beginning of side 3, and I got a little worried, but it played through it, thankfully. So, of course, you see the original one sheet. It's a glossy cover. You know, it looks nice, even though it is Batman and Robin. And, you know, over the years, and especially if you read the production history, you can tell from the start, from the get-go, they were just pretty much screwed. It was just not going to turn out well. The fact that every decision had to go through the toy companies first, and they literally had no real pre-production time or anything. So if you read the production history, you can see very quickly where all of the flaws that everybody loves to point out really started to manifest themselves. And but, you know, on Laserdisc, it's a fantastic transfer. It's a later release. You get a 2.0 stereo surround, and you get a 5.1 AC3 track. You know, if you manage to find one that's not rotted, it's great picture quality, great audio quality. And again, like on Batman Forever, I kind of have to give the nod a little bit towards the 2.0 track. It's not quite as distinct an improvement as Batman Forever, but I played both of them, and I kind of leaned more towards the 2.0 for some reason. I don't know if it's that a certain mixer at Warner Brothers at the time did that, because I've heard other Warner discs, other old vintage reviews, like on Widescreen Review of certain Warner titles, that would be in there saying that they preferred the 2.0 to the 5.1. But that's just another one of these oddities. And like Batman Forever and the other Batman films, the first flipper DVDs used this same transfer. So if you've seen those, you've pretty much seen what this is going to look like. But still, it's nice to finally have this to complete the set. And again, if you find one that doesn't have rot on it, you know, give it a shot. All right, here we have an interesting release. This is the very hard to find letterbox release of Batman Mr. Freeze Sub-Zero, the second direct-to-video animated feature from the animated series. And I say second, even though Mask of the Phantasm was eventually released theatrically for a short window. This film, technically then, is the first DTV feature made for the upcoming, because of the upcoming Batman and Robin starring Mr. Freeze. And it's really more of a standalone, really big two-parter if you know the series. If you haven't seen it before, definitely do so if you enjoyed the animated series, or use it as a taster if you've never seen an episode of the animated series. This is a not too easy disc to find. I don't think they made too many of these, being as it's a later release and most kids bought it on tape and not Laserdisc. Single disc, no special features or anything. Has the original 2.0 stereo surround mix on the digital tracks, so it sounds great. Warner Archive just came out with this on Blu-ray, so you can grab that, and it looks stellar. The only thing with this release is that it's matted to 1.66 to 1, so it is a widescreen ratioed master. And there's been debate on whether that was the original intent or an alternate intent. And from all the stills I've seen that show the protecting for the matting, I think it's just something they wanted to try to see if it worked. And kind of like how a lot of later cartoons, such as Justice League and other shows, would either air full frame or in a matted version, and then there's still aspect ratio debate on what they were intended to be seen as. But either way, this is a very nice disc, and definitely the hardest to find of the U.S. Batman releases, and it's a nice one to have to complement your ongoing collection. So I was very happy to pick this up, and if you want that alternate framing, this is the disc you're going to need because it hasn't been released anywhere else. Moving on to other hero characters. This film is not very well regarded, but it's kind of a favorite of mine. This is the 1996 adaptation of The Phantom. This is a wonderful Paramount release, and it uses the original theatrical poster, which most people derive for the very cheesy "Slam Evil" tagline printed on there. And I agree, that's probably a bit much, but this movie kind of is that way. It's extremely, I don't know if tongue-in-cheek is the right word, but it's extremely spirited in the way a 30s serial would be, with great production values. And, it really didn't find the audience it deserved, and it had kind of a troubled production history. It could be better, but it has such a great heart that you can't find yourself helping but grinning every once in a while when you watch it. And it does, of course, have a big bunch of Indiana Jones flavor because Jeffrey Boehm wrote the screenplay. Of course, Jeffrey Boehm wrote Last Crusade, so there you go. There's your through line. But this is basically a pulp adventure movie from the old days with 90s production values. Whether this is going to be your thing or not, it's up to you. But this is a great Laserdisc with a fantastic transfer. They used the same master on the DVD, and most people found this film on video anyway, later on after it came out. So it does have a bit of a following now. But the Laserdisc and the DVD share the same master. There is a Blu-ray that went out of print, and I think that even uses either the same master or source material. All three look great. But in terms of the audio, the Blu-ray got a remix, which is inferior to the 5.1 on this disc. This disc has much louder Foley effects in its 5.1 track than the Blu-ray 7.1. And I think the DVD is the same audio track. They seem the same, but this will also give you the option of playing a 2.0 Matrix track as PCM, as opposed to lossy on the DVD. And this one has a little bit less noise because that DVD, of course, is an earlier DVD that's a little bit prone to digital artifacting and noise and stuff. So basically you have the option of having a nice DVD or a great Laserdisc, so there are trade-offs to either side. It's a single disc title. It did get a THX mastering stamp, and like I said, it's a fantastic transfer. Not really anything to gripe about. Fantastic 5.1 AC3. The 2.0 is also good, and it uses both the teaser and theatrical poster for the front cover and then the rear cover. This was another one of the one sheets for this film. I even like how they printed all the text in purple. Even the chapter numbers and the photo outline boxes are purple, so that keeps with the theme of purple. Yes, I know most people automatically start laughing when they see the Phantom's a guy running around in a purple suit in the jungle, but sometimes you need that. And I still think they could make a really great Phantom film. But anyway, we are with yet another underrated 90s cult classic. This is the CAV release of the Rocketeer. I actually just picked this up today. I've been trying to find this for ages. Again, uses the one sheet for, well, this is really more the video artwork. The teaser was the beautiful rendering of the Rocketeer that should be on everybody's wall. It's a fantastic poster. But still, this is a nice classic styled image that they used on the various video releases and some of the foreign artworks. This is I've actually seen the CLV version of this before, but I've been trying to hold out and find the CAV version. And of course, like most Disney discs, the only way you can tell is the little triangle up here. And this one actually says widescreen CAV Laserdisc, and you can get tripped up because the CLV says widescreen, I think, special edition Laserdisc. So if you're not careful, you can buy the CLV. Not that I think there's much difference between the two in terms of transfer, but it does have a Dolby Surround 2.0 Matrix track, digital PCM, which is great. Like I said, I've watched the CLV version before. Unfortunately, you don't get a discrete 5.1 like you do on the DVD and Blu-rays, and of course this film did get a 70mm blow-up, so the Laserdisc is probably more akin to what you would have heard on the 35mm release in Dolby Stereo. Nice jacket. Again, pretty straightforward, and you can see it's the typical Disney layout. But like I said, I've got to get this cranked up. I want to see what this CAV transfer looks like. The CLV disc looked pretty close to what the DVD was. I think the DVD they slapped the master on a disc and called it a day. Disney's never put too much into this film because it was not financially successful for them, and so when that happens, it's like, nope, out the door. And this is another film. It could have it really needed a sequel. It deserved one. And this is really one of those, another forgotten 90s gem. And thankfully, more and more people talk about this one these days. And here we go again with yet another 90s title. This is the letterboxed version of The Shadow. This is the regular standard release from Universal. It just has a Matrix 2.0 track on the digital tracks, which sounds pretty good, and it has a letterbox transfer. For the longest time, the DVDs were sort of an open mat, and so were the VHS tapes for the longest time until the Blu-ray releases. The only way to see this film letterboxed was on Laserdisc. So, but this film really never got a fair shake. It was kind of dumped into theaters just like some of these others, and by that time most people didn't know about the character's history or anything. But it really is a piece of work. It's got a great sense of darkness and whimsical humor. It's sort of, if you crossed Batman 89, I hate to say it, maybe with a little dash of Clue and maybe a little dash of Flash Gordon, just a little bit. Maybe a touch of Highlander because they shared the same director. But I really enjoy this film. I actually first saw it on Laserdisc. I didn't get to see it in the theater. I found the DTS Laserdisc by sheer chance, and that was my first DTS title. And I saw this and immediately had to see it again. I was like, where has this been all my life? It's not for everyone, and yes, it has dated in some aspects, but it's just a wonderful film that never got a fair shake, I don't think. And being a DTS launch title, this film came out basically a couple months after Jurassic Park, when Universal was really pushing the DTS system that they and Spielberg had backed. So a lot of the early DTS titles have really good invasive soundtracks, and this film is no exception. As far as transfer and disc quality, this is bare bones, just single disc, two-sided. It's a pretty nice transfer. It has more color to it, actually, than the DTS reissue and the DVDs and the Blu-rays. So if you like comparing transfers, you'll want to pick this one up. I picked it up simply to try out the 2.0 Matrix track and compare it to the DTS version and other audio tracks on other releases. And it holds up. You know, it's the same great mix, but you're not able to get the same level of discrete quality that's in the DTS and other versions. But, you know, if this is the only version you have, or you see it for $1, because this is a very common title, you know, definitely give it a spin. It's a really fun film that really deserved a better chance. And the reputation seems to be kind of coming around a little bit, which I'm kind of happy about, because usually I feel like I'm just, you know, talking in the dark about this and the other 90s films. I mean, some of the Rocketeer has a better following these days, and the Phantom, you can occasionally find fans, but the Shadow, not so much. Usually it's the least seen of these films that kind of got kick-started with Dick Tracy. Of course, we have to show off the wonderful DTS edition. Of course, you know, it's the same jacket, just with the DTS bar applied. This is the one time I've ever found a DTS disc just in the Laserdisc bin for a low price, still in the shrink wrap. So that was an immediate purchase. You know, that wasn't there was no debate. And I love on both of these how the alternate artwork that they've used for all the video releases on tape and Sense, how it just blends in well with the black background on top and bottom. Of course, being the Shadow lives in darkness and thrives in darkness, so of course the cover should be dark. And here's the rear, it's the same thing. The printing on this jacket's a little better because this disc actually came out, I think, in '97 or so, so it's pressed much later. Picture quality is outstanding. Like I said, the older disc has some more color to it. This transfer is a touch colder, but it has some finer detail, being that it's a master from '97 as opposed to '94. But the big draw is the DTS soundtrack, which is absolutely fantastic. It holds up against every other version I've compared it to, even the 2 different Blu-rays that are out. Again, it's the same track on all of them, but I mean, this thing holds its own, and they sound virtually identical. I might personally give the nod to this one because I have a lot of nostalgia attached to it, because this disc was the first way I finally got to see the film in its entirety, and it's a fantastic disc. Again, bare bones, single disc, 2-sided, but this is one of my favorite discs of my whole collection, because I enjoy pulling it out every time, and it's a wonderful, fun film that I wish more people knew about. And it has one of, as far as I'm concerned, one of Jerry Goldsmith's finest scores. It's a fantastic score. You should watch this film for the soundtrack, the sound mix alone. Both are absolutely worth, an hour and 45 minutes of your time. Now here we come to what I consider one of the most essential discs you can own on the format in terms of alternate versions, soundtracks, etc. This is the standard letterboxed Warner release of Superman the movie. It's a relatively common disc. It's from about 1990 or 91 or so. This was the first really major letterbox release of this film, and the pan and scan transfers really kind of wrecked a lot of the compositions, but that's how a lot of people and kids, and myself included, first saw this film on TV airings and such, sometimes with the extended footage or deleted scenes put back into some of the TV edits. It's a standard Warner rear, but it's printed in a glossy jacket, which is kind of nice. It makes this look a little more prestigious. I think they kind of printed the front large to match the Batman jacket, sort of to give them that prestige look a little bit. The picture transfer is, well, it's okay. This film, was shot with a lot of soft focus and diffusion, and the different locations were photographed differently. So Krypton was photographed one way, the Metropolis scenes were photographed another way, the Smallville scenes were photographed another way. And even when you see a 35mm print of this or the Blu-rays, there's a lot of grain, there's a lot of soft focus, a lot of diffused lighting. So it's got its own style, and it's not necessarily going to always be the most pretty thing to look at. And it's a very hard film to transfer. So the transfer here is pretty noisy. It's rather soft. Don't go into this expecting a fantastic Laserdisc transfer, because it's okay. It's watchable, but if you don't have the best setup, you're not going to really be too happy with the picture quality on this. And that's not to say it's bad or anything. It's not, but it's just a very hard film to transfer, especially in letterbox on NTSC standards, where you're already losing most of your picture information to the letterboxing. But what's really important about this release, and something I've never been able to really verify outside of other people who have this disc, the audio track is a 2.0 matrixed mix on the digital tracks. But for some reason, and I don't know why, all I can guess is maybe it was a 70mm mix source. Is that what was used? Because there were several mixes done for this film originally before it was released in '78. But for some reason, when you play this back in a home theater environment and you matrix the channels back out using ProLogic 2, whatever you use, it's so much better defined. The sound separation is so much better. The rear surround is used so much better. And it's still the original mix. No effects have been changed, like the 5.1 mix that's premiered with the extended version on DVD, where they added new effects and made a lot of fans upset. But if you compare it to the 1978 Dolby Stereo track that's available on the later DVDs and Blu-rays as a 2.0, the other one almost sounds like flat mono, and it sounded that way in theaters because I've seen a print with that, an original print with that track, and you know, it was basically like you were watching a mono movie almost. There's very little stereo separation, it's very flat, and comparing that track to this is night and day. So I don't know why they've never used this again, or if it got lost, or if they just don't know it exists, because this is the best sounding version of Superman I've ever heard. And you'll notice it right off the bat, because in a when it's decoded in your home theater, the opening where the text is read from the comic book and the theatrical typesetting, I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, but when the camera pans off into the opening titles and the blackness of space, on this disc it's mixed in a way to where the opening dialogue narration, the title being read by the little child, is actually in your center channel in mono, and it's kind of mixed down with John Williams' score faintly in there, and it's all in mono. Almost sounds slightly canned in a way. And then when the titles start to come in, it basically swooshes all the way through out into your home theater in full defined 4-channel sound, and it's absolutely an epic moment. It's one of my favorite mix moments I've ever encountered. And so since that's been lost, and the other track doesn't sound anywhere near as good as this, and then the 5.1 has all the new effects and stuff, every time I want to watch the film I wind up having to go back to this, even though the picture quality isn't that good. I also prefer the theatrical cut, and that's what you get on this disc, which is nice. I've been told by some other folks that there's a mid-90s Japanese pressing that has much better video quality and has this same mix, but I haven't been able to track that down yet because it usually costs quite a bit, but I'm planning to find that soon. And here we have the letterboxed Superman 2 reissue. This one's not too easy to find. It came out in about 95, I think. So they didn't press as many of these. Most of the time you find a pan and scan version of this. This is the Richard Lester theatrical version, because this is way before they made the Donner cut. It's a standard jacket, 2 discs, and so that means it's pretty common to get some ring wear and bending because it's a standard Warner jacket. And I got this actually still sealed, and of course it meant all the corners had kind of bent in a little, but I was just happy to finally find this because it, like I said, is rather uncommon, surprisingly so. I just don't think they printed too many of these. Superman 3 is really hard to find, and they never made a letterbox Superman 4 here in the States, really. So here's the rear, and of course, being a mid to late 90s Warner release, it's a much nicer rear cover instead of the standard Warner blob here and there. But no special features outside the theatrical trailer. It's a pretty good transfer, pretty good sound mix. It's 2.0 Matrix, Dolby Surround, PCM. So yeah, it's a nice disc to have. And I think they reused the same master for the early waves of DVDs. They did, I think, 2 waves. They did the first DVDs, which were bare bones, and then they did the special editions. And then they struck new masters when they made the new HD transfers. Of course, what's important about the Superman films, at least the original 4 films, the Blu-rays, when they made the new masters, a lot of them got a dusting, shall we say, of the teal recoloring phase, and that's currently going on. And you can see there have been clips uploaded to YouTube and other places where they compare the various different versions, and basically if you have the DVDs or Laserdiscs or before, it's going to look like you remember it, but the newer HD masters and the Superman anthology set, you can definitely see there's been some application of the teal recoloring that a lot of people are very fond of. You know, it's not always very blatant to the naked eye, but it is there. So that's another note about having some of these earlier versions. Last but not least, the aforementioned Superman 3 letterboxed edition. I just found this. I was actually quite excited to find it. Like I said, it's quite rare. I've never actually seen one in person. I've just seen it, when people find them or they show off their Superman discs. Pretty much the same design as the Superman 2 jacket. I think this came out in '96, so they must have made even less of them. Nice glossy cover, but again, it's 2 discs inside of a flimsy jacket, so it's very prone to getting seam splits. This has a little bit of one here, and thankfully the corners aren't crumpled and there's no ring wear or anything. Whoever owned this took really good care of their discs. Similar style jacket without the usual Warner blobs, which is nice. I haven't got to spin this one yet, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be very similar to the first letterbox DVD of Superman 3. And it has the 2.0 Dolby Surround PCM. It should be the original theatrical Dolby Stereo audio. It does have the theatrical trailer. It's spread across 3 sides, but no special features or anything. So I'm excited to see what this looks like, even though I'm really not a fan of this film. It has some great moments and then some really terrible ones. I haven't gotten Superman 4 yet because you have to try and track down the longer version on the Japanese Laserdisc, and that can get very pricey. So that's going to do it for the comic characters and superheroes shelf.